Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Madeline Mejia, and I'm one of the VPs of programs for the Harbor Club of Southern California. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm co-hosting this event on critical race theory, what it is, what it isn't, and what you should know. I'm also very happy here to have these great scholars who will be sharing their wisdom and their knowledge with us. I would like to share with you that this event is organized as part of the Anti-Racism Committee, the Harvard Club's Anti-Racism Committee. This committee came about as a response to the murder of George Floyd and all the racial inequality that we were acknowledging and reckoning with in 2020. The purpose of this committee is threefold. One, to educate Harvard alumni in Southern California about racial inequality. Two, to engage with each other on these issues. And three, to support efforts to dismantle systemic racism in all its forms and support the Black community, particularly in Southern California. I would like to introduce you to Jose Sanchez. Jose, thank you so much for bringing together these great scholars to share their knowledge and their wisdom with us.
Thank you, Madeline. I'm excited to welcome and introduce our two experts. First, Taifha Alexander currently serves as the CRT Forward Project Director, which is part of the UCLA Law School's Critical Race Studies program. She leads the law school's response to the attacks on critical race theory alongside a team of faculty, staff, and student researchers. Taifha was born and raised in Jamaica, Queens, where she attended college at St. John's University. Taifha earned her JD from Georgetown and later earned her LLM from the UCLA School of Law. She has over 12 years of experience in higher education. Her legal studies and research are focused at the intersection of law, critical race studies, higher education, social justice, and equity. Taifha has been recognized by both national and state higher education organizations for her ability to create more equitable campus climates across the country. She's also published several articles, including Why We Can't Breathe, How Top Law Schools Can Resuscitate an Inclusive Climate for Minority and Low-Income Law Students, which appeared in the Georgetown Journal of Modern Critical Race Perspectives. Chopped and Screwed, Hip Hop from Cultural Expression to a Means of Criminal Enforcement, which appeared in the Harvard Journal of Sports and Entertainment. She's currently working on a chapter that's to be included in a forthcoming book titled Revising the Curriculum and the Co-Curriculum to Engage Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Our second guest, Professor Laura Gómez, is the Rachel F. Moran Endowed Chair in Law at the UCLA School of Law, and she also has appointments in the departments of Sociology and Chicana and Chicano and Central American Studies at UCLA. Laura co-founded the UCLA Law's Critical Race Studies program and has twice served as faculty director. She was born in Roswell, New Mexico, and grew up in Albuquerque's North Valley. She graduated from Harvard College and received her law degree and PhD in sociology from Stanford. She was the first Mexican-American woman in the US to earn these joint degrees. After law school, she clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Laura is nationally recognized as an expert on anti-Latino racism, Latinx people and the law and society, critical race theory, and the sociology of race. She's written various books, including Inventing Latinos, A New Story of American Racism, Manifest Destinies, The Making of the Mexican-American Race, Mapping Race, Critical Research on Health Disparities, and Misconceiving Mothers, Legislators, Prosecutors, and the Politics of Prenatal Drug Exposure. Inventing Latinos appeared on NPR's Best Books of 2020 list. Laura teaches a variety of courses, including criminal law, civil procedure, constitutional law, critical race theory, Latinos and the law, and law and society. She received an Outstanding Scholar Award in 2021 from the Fellows of the American Bauer Foundation, and she's also held fellowships at the Stanford Humanities Center and the School for Advancing Research in Santa Fe. Laura also served as interim dean of UCLA's Division of Social Sciences and vice dean of the UCLA Law School. Laura and Taifha, thank you for joining us today. Let me now turn it over to Laura, who will begin the conversation and set the stage on what critical race theory is. Taifha will then talk about the CRT Forward project. Please feel free to put comments and questions in the Zoom chat along the way. Because we have so many attendees, which obviously is wonderful, Madeline and I will be managing the Q&A in the order that they appear, but we may not be able to get to all of your comments and questions, and we apologize in advance. With that, I hand it over to Laura.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see old friends from the Harvard Club of Southern California board. I want to thank all of you for being here in the audience. I want to thank Madeline because we had originally wanted to do a program on CRT 2 years ago. We started talking about it, and I want to thank Jose for revisiting this and kind of convincing me that people were still interested in the topic. So very happy to be here. And finally, I want to just give a shout out to Taifha, my colleague and my friend and my former student who is doing incredible work that you'll hear about shortly. I want to begin with a few introductory points, and then I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes about how I understand critical race theory. Obviously, the Supreme Court decided a landmark case on affirmative action today, in particular, no less involving Harvard. And so I'm going to try to work some analysis of that case into my comments as well to illustrate some of the points that I'm making. So 3 quick introductory points. I started my studies at Stanford in the late 1980s, just as the field known as critical race theory emerged. I consider myself lucky because as a law student, I studied with some of the founding generation of CRT, Chuck Lawrence, Mari Matsuda, Pat Williams, and Angela Harris, all of whom were on the faculty or visiting professors at Stanford Law School during my time there. When I began my teaching career at UCLA in 1993, I was brought into the CRT field by attending what some called our summer camps. And since those early days, CRT has become one of the most exciting fields of legal study. CRT scholars have written scholarly articles and books about every topic in the law, not just constitutional law, which I think is probably obvious, but also tax law, contract law, property law, torts, criminal procedure and substantive criminal law, even sports law. Another measure of how critical race theory has become solidified as an academic field is that it has been embraced and adapted by disciplines outside the legal academy. For example, CRT is studied in graduate schools of education, in ethnic studies departments, and in criminology, to name just some. My remarks today will focus on what I know and study, which is CRT in the legal academy, but please know that there are other different and usually complementary approaches to CRT. So what is critical race theory? I will boil it down to 3 essential claims. And to deepen our understanding of each, I'll use the affirmative action example to illustrate each one. So 3 central ideas. Number 1, CRT is rooted in a historical analysis of American nation building and the role of law in that process. A shorthand for that concept for this is the concept of white supremacy, which since the murder by police of George Floyd in 2020 and the national and even international mass movement that resulted has become part of everyday lingo for many Americans. In CRT, we approach American history as inherently white supremacist, as in the following example. Number 1, the CRT assumption that English settlers were racially and religiously superior to the indigenous peoples of North America, which gave birth to a legal theory called the doctrine of discovery, under which the Supreme Court ruled that Indians, because they were savages and heathens, were incapable of owning property. And so that their land devolved to whichever European power first discovered the land. Number two, the CRT assumption that from 1619 until at least the Emancipation Proclamation, roughly 250 years, judges, Congress, the executive branch, and state legislatures all protected the right of whites, and in some cases, Native Americans, to own Black people and their progeny in perpetuity as entirely legal, constitutionally, and frequently as a God-given right. And number three, the CRT assumption that even after we fought a civil war, the Supreme Court and Congress and states held that separate but equal was the law of the land, thereby handicapping African Americans in ways that continue to account for the Black-white wealth disparity, for disparities in educational attainment, in health outcomes, and in arrest, convictions, and imprisonment between Blacks and whites that themselves justified the need for institutions to take affirmative action to achieve meaningful progress toward racial equality. Number two, whereas most legal scholars and conventional wisdom generally believe that racism is rare and aberrational, CRT sees racism as hardwired into our social, political, economic, and legal systems. In other words, as Trevor Noah likes to say, racism is like corn syrup. It's in everything. Conventional wisdom instead thinks about discrimination and prejudice as individual problems and therefore having individual case-by-case solutions. Today's majority opinion in Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus Harvard is a case in point. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion. And if you think about racism from this narrow approach, you see individual victims and individual perpetrators, and you focus on racism as skin color, which in and of itself is meaningless. From this standpoint, limited affirmative action that takes race into account as one of many different kinds of diversity offends the Constitution. But if you see it from the perspective of Justice Sotomayor's dissenting opinion, you understand racism as structural rather than as individual, as about group-based inequality rather than skin color, and affirmative action as part of the ongoing process of enforcing the vision of equality announced in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and represented by the Civil Rights Act of 1954 and 1964. One quote by Justice Sotomayor in her dissent, I think, captures the spirit of CRT. She says, quote, "At bottom, the 6 unelected members of today's majority upend the status quo based on their policy preferences about what race in America should be like, but is not, and their preferences for a veneer of color blindness in a society where race has always mattered and continues to matter in fact and in law." So this idea that race matters because it's built in these structural or institutional ways is what she's getting at. Okay, so I want to close by with one final point about critical race theory. Unlike some legal scholars, by no means all of them, CRT scholars feel no need to claim neutrality when it comes to racial oppression. CRT takes the position in favor of human liberation and against racism, period. In this respect, CRT differs both from the liberal mainstream in the legal academy and from the far left scholars who were some of the kind of predecessors to CRT. So for example, in the 1970s, there was a leftist movement in law schools in the legal academy called critical legal studies. And like CRT, many of my teachers at Stanford Law School came out of this school of thought. While that field is diverse, while CRT is diverse, with many disagreements within the tent of critical race theory, critical race scholars reject the nihilism that characterized these critical legal studies scholars who argued that equal rights serve to legitimate ongoing subordination, and in general, rejected rights, rejected almost like a legal solution. Instead, critical race theory scholars embraced the transformative vision of the long civil rights movement, replete with partial victories won through painful, protracted struggle, including the Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of the 1960s, and even the ongoing struggle today. So, like liberals, critical race scholars recognize that those laws made a difference in the lives of subordinated people and therefore represented resistance to white supremacy. At the same time, we're more critical than liberals about the limits of the law, the ability of law to create institutional change. One final example regarding affirmative action, and then I will turn it over to Taifha. Many critical race scholars have long criticized affirmative action. They have basically said it's too little, too late. In essence, it focuses only on individuals, so it will never lead to systematic change. But others see it as making a meaningful change little by little, and over time having a kind of snowball effect. In today's Supreme Court opinion, it's conservatives like Justice Thomas who seem to be the nihilists. Justice Thomas wrote, talking about Justice Ketanji Jackson Brown, quote, "As she sees things, we are all inexorably trapped in a fundamentally racist society with the original sin of slavery and the historical subjugation of Black Americans still determining our lives today," unquote. And I think that captures a kind of wrong-headed and a very narrow view of what racial equality could mean in our country. And with that, I will turn it over to Taifha.
Thank you so much, Laura. I can listen to you talk all day about these topics, but I am excited to provide some additional information about a resource out of the UCLA School of Law Critical Race Studies program, and that's CRT Forward. But before I share more about the resource, I want to acknowledge that my colleagues, our knowledge producers on this project, who are not physically present here, but who work alongside me to ensure the accuracy, maintenance, and overall comprehensiveness of this project are recognized. And those folks include our CRT Forward leadership team and our team of undergraduate and law school research assistants. And so I have to give them their flowers and acknowledge them here in this space. And so with that said, in the time that I have with you all today, I'm going to take a few moments to discuss the CRT Forward Tracking Project, its founding, and the utility of the tracking project as a resource in identifying national, content-specific, and other trends and patterns in the proliferation of anti-CRT activity, or as we call it, government actions that aim to restrict access to truthful information about race and systemic racism through a campaign to reject critical race theory. And so faculty and staff at the Critical Race Studies program realized that there were some significant gaps in information about the assault on CRT. Namely, there were many organizations and groups doing the good work and the valuable work of identifying anti-CRT measures at either the local levels or the state and federal legislative levels. So we had, up until the launch of CRT Forward, lots and lots of information about what was going on in states where the legislatures were banning a distorted version of an understanding of CRT, like places like South Carolina, Texas, Georgia, and Florida, just to name a few. But those sorts of investigations only told part of the story. There were also local school boards, city and county councils, attorney generals, state school boards of education, and governors who were introducing and enacting CRT measures. And because only part of the story was being told, the value that CRT Forwards adds is telling a fuller, more accurate story of the pervasiveness of the assault on critical race theory. And so the tracking project is an up-to-date, easily accessible clearinghouse of local, state, and federal government activity aimed at limiting access to truthful information about race and systemic racism through this campaign to reject critical race theory. And so this anti-CRT activity at the local, state, and federal levels is not only identified and tracked, but we also substantively analyze each and every measure to determine, for example, which types of institutions are being targeted, like, for example, K through 12 education or state and federal government agencies. We're also looking at the type of conduct that's either being prohibited or required, like, for example, teaching or curricular surveillance. We're looking at, in addition to those things, the specific features of the prohibition or the requirement. Are there discussions in the anti-CRT measure about the 1619 project? Is critical race theory specifically named, or are certain divisive concepts being invoked? And finally, we're looking at whether there are any sort of funding or withholding of funding or creating of a private cause of action that would present as an enforcement provision on these measures. And so in addition to the filtering and identifying and tracking and substantively analyzing of these anti-CRT measures, there are a few other features that make this project unique. One is that my colleagues and I have recognized that simply telling people which entities are being targeted and which features are included wasn't enough. It was important, especially in this moment, to be transparent in how we've analyzed these measures, and to do so by making the full text of the anti-CRT measures available for everyone to review them themselves. So as you'll see in this video, users can navigate to the website, select the state of interest, search for the measure in the panel, select the measure, and then read the full text of the measure itself. And so one of the main goals of the tracking project is to provide academics, journalists, researchers, organizers, advocates, parents, teachers, and those who are just committed to truth and justice with a unique resource to better understand the scope and trends in the recent local, state, and federal anti-CRT measures aimed at restricting access to truthful information about race and systemic racism. And so there are about 670 anti-CRT measures in our database. And since creating this presentation, that number has grown to nearly 700. And so most of these measures target K through 12 education. And for every one rejected anti-CRT measure, between 3 and 4 have been enacted, which supports a whole new spin on the adage that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its shoes on. And so in this instance, the lies about CRT have been able to travel the world 4 times before the truth about CRT has had an opportunity to catch up. And so this is a pictorial representation of that adage, right? What you're looking at here is the result of another interesting filtering option. And the image on the left is depicting where measures have been introduced and failed. And the image on the right shows where measures have been introduced and enacted. And so this particular filtering option is especially interesting to me because, as our data has demonstrated, anti-CRT measures have been introduced from Alaska to New Hampshire and nearly everywhere in between, with the exception of Delaware. And so for a very long time, the narrative in media was that these anti-CRT measures have been limited to conservative states, but the CRT Forward Tracking Project data approach of identifying, tracking, and substantively analyzing anti-CRT measures at all levels to also include non-legislative measures show us that this is happening in nearly everyone's backyard. Like, for example, in California, there have been 11 different anti-CRT measures that have been introduced and 7 that have been enacted, impacting about 100,000 students in California's K-12 schools. There have also been some trends, and I'll skip over this a little because Laura did such a phenomenal job discussing a lot of these tenets. But when we are reviewing these anti-CRT measures, one of the things that we are really looking for is concepts that were operationalized in the now rescinded Equity Gag Order, Executive Order 13950. Concepts that have been falsely attributed to and weaponized against CRT to, as one anti-CRT architect put it, to successfully freeze the brand CRT in public conversation and drive up negative perceptions. So in order to be successful in this strategy, the architects of the anti-CRT campaign have co-opted, redefined, and weaponized core tenets of CRT, as Laura has already explained them to us, to intentionally mislead the public. And to help demonstrate the impact of this strategy, is helpful to remember some of the concepts that Laura has already discussed with us, especially the concept that no race is innately superior to another. And CRT is very much, that is very much a fundamental tenet of critical race theory, that no race is innately superior to another. And CRT explicitly rejects any such essentialist conceptions of race. And so I want to share this last slide with you. In my role in this position, it's been extremely interesting to see the evolution of anti-CRT measures, because when I first started, the measures were really just mimicking a lot of the nonsensical arguments that were put forward in the Trump administration's now rescinded executive order. But since then, there have been an evolution in the targets and sites of attacks, especially as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anything that can be tangentially or related in any form, shape, or matter to critical race theory. Anything that's committed to racial or social justice is now becoming a target of these anti-CRT architects. And the anti-CRT measures that we have now found are broader, meaner, and extremer. And so it's important to remember that each of us have some sort of commitment in order to stand up for racial and social justice. And I will end my comments there and bring the program back to Jose.
Thank you, Taifha. Thank you, Laura. So as we begin our Q&A discussion, I invite you all to put comments, questions in the chat. And as I said earlier, we will manage them and read them and pose the questions to our experts. Laura, maybe I can get us started. You reminded me of when we were in law school and that we did in fact have the benefit of being taught by Mari, Chuck, many of the architects, the initial faculty that was writing and teaching in this area. So the fact that it's been around for a while, why do you believe, and I know Taifha sort of touched on this a little bit, but why do you believe the attacks on CRT arose when they did?
I think that if you go back and look in the history, and I'm actually going to put something into the chat for everyone. Hopefully the link will work, but if it doesn't work, you can actually see the title. But Taifha referred to the executive order. This was then President Trump's executive order of August 2020. And in part, it was a response to the murder of George Floyd and the summer of protest and the rise and kind of mainstreaming of Black Lives Matter. In part, it was a function of Trump being in a very close re-election race, which he ultimately lost. And so there was a kind of convergence in this moment of, we got to do something, and a kind of culture war revival. And the article that I put in the chat, New Yorker article, actually explains that it was a conservative operative, Paul Rufo, who came up, or maybe it was Chris Rufo, who came up with this idea of critical race theory is the perfect boogeyman. And he partnered with Tucker Carlson to make this a national cause celeb on conservative media. And that kind of started this snowballing at a time in which it was politically expedient for Trump. And it was, I think, tapping into a sense of grievance that people felt about the Black Lives Matter and about the summer of protest, in which people were kind of in the street talking about white supremacy and kind of concepts that were kind of esoteric in my law school critical race theory course were kind of in the mainstream. So I think those are the origins, but I think Taifha has done a great job in her team of actually looking at how far. None of us thought at the time. I remember writing an op-ed around the time, let's see, so maybe in late August or early September. And if you had asked me at that time, is this going to have legs? Is this going to continue? I would have said, no way, but it has. And the fact that that's a stunning number, that Taifha, that you gave us, that 11 anti-CRT bills have been introduced in California school districts, and 7 of them have been adopted, right? So it shows you how pervasive it has become and how it's continued to be. I think now we would say it falls under the rubric that DeSantis is using of kind of wokeism, right? So it's still very much with us.
Thank you so much for that response and those comments, Laura. I do have a question here. Does CRT have an objective beyond theory? In other words, is there an activist component?
I will go ahead and hopefully make my former professor proud here, that CRT is both a theory, right, and a practice, right? It's difficult to learn about all of these topics and how race is implicated and how racial power has been constituted and then reconstituted in the law, and then to not do anything about that, right? And so one of the main commitments of critical race theory is a liberation commitment, right? To learn about how the law has instituted racial subordination throughout time and has contributed to the social conditions in which we're currently living in, and a commitment to ensure that those racial injustices do not continue to persist, right? A liberation from racial injustice is inherently baked into critical race theory, which is why it is so near and dear to my heart. And these scholars and theorists are so important to ensuring we can live up to our full potential as a multiracial democracy. So a long way to say yes.
I guess one of the other, I guess the focus, as you've said, Taifha, has been on education and K through 12 education in particular. Yet, as we've talked about, right, CRT is about, it's taught in law schools and conversation among scholars and legal experts. So why is the focus on what is being taught to kids in most recent time? And either of you can answer this together, or anybody can start.
Taifha, why don't you go? I think you have a more current analysis of that.
Okay, perfect. And I think a lot of what Laura shared in the beginning too is helpful to understand, right? Because CRT did start in the legal field and has since expanded into other areas. But going back to the summer of 2020, what we did see was this nascent movement among K through 12 educators and everyone generally thinking about and asking themselves, what is it that I am doing, or what is it that I am not doing that has contributed to the public murder of a human being by a police officer, right? And so a lot of educators really took that to heart and began to incorporate discussions about race and policy into their classrooms. Case in point was a Chicago 7th grade teacher started teaching students about redlining in Chicago, and then connecting those redlining, those racist policies, right, to current lived conditions that the students in Chicago public housing were experiencing as it related to environmental injustice and things like that, right? And so while those students weren't necessarily learning about theories of intersectionality or essentialism, right? They were engaging in the foundation of critical race theory and identifying what policies and structures have contributed to their current lived experiences and hypothesizing about a world in which those conditions do not exist, right? And so I think that's what was going on in K through 12 education. And I think when the response is, well, you know, we're not really teaching that in K through 12, which might be true. It's also positioning CRT as bad, right? Because the underlying thought within that question is, well, it's not being done in K through 12, so we don't have to worry. And I think that that's harmful to the theory, and that there is some utility in it that can be age appropriate for K through 12 education, but this distancing technique limits our ability to identify that and to be able to do that. And I'll pass to Laura as well if she has any additional comments.
I think that was terrific. Why don't we just move on to another question? Because I know this is a big audience. I want to make sure we get the chance to hear from more people.
Yeah, there's another question here. Given our current political climate and various court rulings, how do you see CRT adjusting and moving forward into the future?
So I want to kind of distinguish two things, right? So the and maybe there's some overlap, but if we imagine a Venn diagram and one circle being the attacks on CRT at the K through 12 level, which is the vast majority, I think, of what's going on in terms of the school board actions and even state level actions. And if we look at the other circle, and the other circle is how critical race theory is taught in, say, graduate school, right? Post college education, whether in education schools where Madeline teaches, or in law schools, studies departments. And if we think about those, there's not necessarily very much overlap between those two Venn diagrams. So one answer is what is happening in terms of the anti-CRT backlash is not really affecting people like me. I mean, I'm tenured. You know, I teach at UCLA. We have a huge critical race studies program. We have upwards of 25% of every law school class is interested in specializing in critical race studies. So we're going on and doing what we do. But at the same time, I have heard about colleagues who are not tenured and who are in particular in teaching in Florida and teaching in Texas, and they are finding their academic freedom really limited, right? In terms of what they can teach even to undergraduates or graduate students. So I think that it's kind of a two-track kind of response. CRT will keep doing what it's doing. You know, I'll bring it back to affirmative action again, and just kind of, for those of you, because there's been a lot of people who've come in since I finished my remarks, but there will be some people in the field of critical race theory who say, it's good that affirmative action is gone, because it was kind of like this, it was kind of this narcotic that we were holding on to and fighting for, but we weren't really getting very much from it. It wasn't giving us real systemic change. It was giving sort of individuals particular opportunities, but at the same time, it wasn't making a big difference. Versus those in critical race theory who would say, actually, we need every tool that we have, you know, to try to achieve equality. And so we're really going to be suffering for that. And I'll give you one example. I fall into the second camp, and I'll give you one example. So I teach at UCLA. I'm wrapping up, as some of you know, I have moved to Albuquerque. I'm wrapping up my time at UCLA this coming fall semester. And out of a faculty of 72 tenured or tenure track law professors, I'm the only Mexican American law professor, the only one in Los Angeles, which is shocking to me. And I would say that that's in large part because Prop 209 in 1996 meant that we could not take race into account as a plus factor in hiring as a state entity. So you know, I think both of those tracks are kind of proceeding at once.
Thank you so much for this, Laura. There are many questions that are in the chat, so I want to make sure that I'm catching all of them. And I know you, you know, you touched on this at your beginning comments. So thoughts on the Supreme Court ruling? I know we just had this, you know, big news today, and it so happened to coincide with this event. How do we look at this through the CRT lens, the whole affirmative action, and what would be us here as a Harvard community, our next steps on how we continue to educate others who are not aware of the benefits of CRT?
Taifha, I'll give a short answer. I talked about this quite a bit in my opening remarks, and so to honor those of you who were here for that time, I won't go through any of that, but I will say that there are a couple of ways in which the Supreme Court leaves a very narrow space in today's majority opinions, a very narrow space for affirmative action to continue. One is, and this is very important, that the Supreme Court did not say, the majority did not say that students cannot write about race in their personal essays, in making their stories heard, intelligible to admissions officers. They just said that the school can't a priori kind of use that as a plus factor. But they didn't say it couldn't be looked at individually. And the other thing, this was an interesting footnote, so it makes me think maybe there are other footnotes to come in the future. Chief Justice Roberts, in his majority opinion, said it's a totally different thing when we're talking about the military academies, and I'm not talking about that. And that was interesting, a way of blunting the pro-affirmative statements and amicus briefs, amicus curiae briefs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I actually want to bring in Jose here because you're working in a private sector context, oftentimes talking about diversity and inclusion. And I just wonder, is there an argument to be made that there also can be, you know, how do you see today's ruling affecting that kind of private sector diversity initiatives?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm actually going to pivot a little bit, right, in terms of I was maybe many of you have seen the message provided by the newly elected president of Harvard, right, that this decision, despite its disappointing nature, needs to have us recommit to sort of the values and the important work of showing how diversity, the benefits of diversity in the educational setting. And I think what I would say is that in corporate America, what I've been surprised to see is that they are understanding the benefits of a diverse set of professionals, especially when they are providing goods and services to diverse communities in the US or outside of the US, right? Without understanding the perspectives of different cultures, of different groups of people, sort of that, and also the intersectionality that we all have. We aren't as effective both in how we deliver the good and service, but even if we're trying to address new challenges or problems, you know, coming up with solutions, if we're in the consulting arena or in AI or whatever the problem is that we're trying to solve for, a lot of corporate, a lot of parts of corporate America have looked at the benefits and can show the business case for having diverse teams looking at problems and developing solutions. I think that will continue. I don't think anything, obviously the way the Supreme Court decision is going to be interpreted in the courts, the way it's going to be used but by folks who want to use it more broadly than what it's holding, will be a challenge in and of itself. But this is in corporate America. I mean, we are relying on diversity as part of us being more effective in the marketplace, especially when we are U.S. companies going outside of the U.S. We've got to be diverse. So I think corporate America understands that. Not, there are different players within corporate America, but I hope that this decision doesn't stop those efforts that have been afoot, before the George Floyd murder, but even afterwards, with the recommitment and increased resources. I think there's a few other comments, Madeline, that you may, let's see.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, there's several comments here. So one, and I'm thinking about this myself because it's something that I also have conversations with my students. Is there any definitive source or resource for K-12 educators that lays out in very basic, accessible language what is CRT? Because a lot of what's going on is folks don't know what CRT is, and they're being misguided and miseducated about what the media or what the right is saying it is, and people are becoming afraid of what to even do in their classrooms. So in your role, do you have any other resources that are very accessible that lays out what is CRT?
Yes, we do have resources that folks can use, and we're working on always creating additional resources. And so I'll share our CRT Forward resources page in the chat. And there are lots of different resources, really quick short videos, different fact sheets and things like that that folks can use. And so I'm going to put it in the chat. One of the things that we are working on is a model measure. So myself and my colleague, Kyle Reinhard, are working on creating a model measure that can be introduced into a state legislature, a local school board, a city or county council that expressly lays out what critical race theory is, its core tenets, and speaks directly to these divisive concepts in opposition as they have been weaponized and utilized throughout the past 2.5 years against critical race theory, to demonstrate that it is okay to teach critical race theory. And not only is it okay, but folks should, as it is age appropriate. And so we're hoping to have that released and available on the resources page by the end of this summer. And so that's something else that people might want to look out for. And the DEI professional in me keeps shouting, the voice inside me keeps shouting just to say that, you know, a lot of the discussions that are being had, a lot of the brawls and physical violence that have taken place in local school boards is the direct result of folks not interested in understanding or listening to logic. Right. And so with any of the resources that I share, I want to expressly state that I'm giving you the best that I got, but sometimes that just won't be enough for some people. And so it really is about being committed to, in the spaces and places that you're in, challenging these opinions and being sure that truth is spoken to power, to ensure that whoever else is in the room, the next future racial justice advocate, the next future president or doctor or lawyer who is going to grow up and say, Madeline talked about this at a school board meeting where my school board was banning a particular book. And that made me decide to continue the good work, even though there were tons of people in that room that didn't want to hear it from her, right? And so I just want to encourage folks to continue to speak truth to power, even if the people that you're speaking to are not receptive or receiving of it, because you never know who's in the room, who you might be directly impacting, who then is going to go forward and do more good work. So the DEI professional in me was shouting, Taifha, do not end your comment without saying that. And so I hope that that's also helpful for folks.
That is very helpful. And if I may, so Danny Solorzano, who is a professor at UCLA, who was my professor when I was an undergrad, and Tara Yoso, who was my advisor when I was at UCLA, and she's also a professor, they have written extensively about CRT. So in the chat, and of course, I will send this all out, all the other resources as well via email. They have taken the 5 tenets of critical race theory and adjusted them or talked about them in the field of education. You will see them in the chat. And so basically this lays out very clearly and directly what are the tenets of CRT in the world of education and why we as human beings and individuals need to be informed about what CRT is and seek that justice that Taifha is talking about, that truth. So we're not misguided by what will be out there or what we might read or hear, or someone who may be very angry and upset misdirect our thinking. And so if you look at one of these tenets, it's like we are all human beings, and race does play a big part in how we all experience the world. And for some, there are some privileges and benefits, and for others, there are not. So that level of awareness and critical thinking is what we need to seek and continue to ask when we have folks who are very angry and upset about education, right? Because we're talking about becoming educated, becoming well-versed on what this is and what this theory and action affords us as human beings. And when someone's really upset about that, we need to ask why they're upset.
Sort of building on that, and I think there was a prior comment before you posted that, Madeline, about those who have attacked CRT being able to effectively use sound bites to misdirect and redirect. And so thinking about that comment that was posted in the chat, can you all speak to examples of successes in fighting some of the anti-CRT measures, or what the project Forward is doing to capture some of those, to sort of provide some lessons learned about what did work in rejecting some of these measures?
Right. So one of the first instances of anti-CRT activity in the country came out of York, Pennsylvania, where there were about between 50 and 100 books that were being banned. And the books range from, there's this book that's called Native Fry Bread, A Story of Indigeneity. And it's a picture book about how integral fry bread is to the indigenous community. Books were banned like How to Be an Anti-Racist and things along those lines. And the students protested. And because the students protested and said, we wanted to learn this, we want access to these books, you cannot unilaterally ban these books just because you do not, or a subset of you do not like these topics. The ban was revoked because students, again, protested and shared that they wanted to learn this information. There was a similar ban that was introduced, and then a protest amongst students in the form of the Virginia governor instituted a tip line. So this was a line that you would either call or email and report instances of critical race theory being taught. After about a week or two, different students from the Gen Z generation inundated the tip line with emails and phone calls saying that they did want to learn this information and that this tip line shouldn't exist. And the tip line was defunct within less than a month of being introduced. There were 3 different school boards in New Hampshire that issued resolutions after the state legislature enacted an anti-CRT measure. And those school boards specifically and explicitly stated that they did not support this anti-CRT state legislation, and they weren't going to implement any sort of bans or restrictions in their education. Durham County School District and Dallas Independent School District also introduced measures to support teaching critical race theory in schools, even though both North Carolina and Texas have enacted anti-CRT measures. And even in California, recently, there's an introduced Assembly Bill 1078 that would restrict school boards and districts from banning materials writ large, right? They're now implementing a process or a procedure for educational agencies to follow before they can remove any sort of instructional materials or cease teaching any sort of particular curriculum. And so that's an introduced measure. And so we're following that one extremely closely. But those are some specific examples of how these anti-CRT measures have been received in different localities across the country.
Thank you, Taifha. Anything else, Laura, on that, or should we go?
The only thing I would say is, and I think we're nearly out of time, but I think that there's a broader context here of how in a pluralistic democratic society, ideas emerge and become kind of the common sense or the conventional narrative, right? Like we have a very strong consensus in our society, I think, except at the fringes, that the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century was a good thing for this country, and that it created positive changes, right? But we may be in the middle of another kind of contestation right now. And on the one hand, we have Black Lives Matter, and we have the 1619 Project by the New York Times, and we have all of this intellectual work being done way broader and more capacious than critical race theory, documenting white supremacy, documenting ongoing racial oppression and historical racial oppression. But there's necessarily resistance to that, and there's kind of maybe passive resistance to it, and there's overt resistance to it. And I think the anti-CRT movement is kind of overt resistance, often deploying attacks for political gain, like for the Trump reelection campaign in 2020, and for other causes. And so I think this is a part of our society, that we have ideas that we kind of go through cycles where we question ideas, and then things emerge eventually on the other side. And I have great confidence that we will get to the other side of this, and we will say, the 1619 Project, that was a major advancement in knowledge and in popular understanding. And but we're not there yet, right? Right now we're in this contested period, and so I think just keeping in mind that kind of broader ebbs and flows, or kind of yin and yang, or give and take, is a natural process. We're looking at big ideas and very different responses to these big ideas in our society, and we don't all agree about them. And so, especially in the midst of ongoing demographic transformations in this country, age-wise and race and ethnicity-wise, I think we're doing okay, but this is a kind of a sign of some of that resistance. As we, not to say that everything that I believe is right, there will be some new conventional wisdom at some point. Won't necessarily be what I agree, but it will be something that is, I would say, from my lights, 1619 Project is pretty mainstream. There's nothing radical about the 1619 Project, right? And so at some point, maybe that will become kind of the conventional wisdom.
Thank you so much. So we have a couple more questions, and folks, I'm getting many messages with many questions, and I really appreciate all the engagement. So is there, and I can partially answer some of this, and of course I'll ask either Joan or Taifha to, Laura or Taifha to chime in. Is there a place for meritocracy in education, or is this not possible as the metric or goal until the current system is dismantled, rebuilt in a non-white supremacist way? Or Should it not be a concept in education under any circumstance to be replaced by something else or simply to be removed?
Oh, I thought you were going to partially answer it.
Oh, I can start. So let's begin with what is meritocracy, right? So this idea that I work very hard, therefore I get. And this is a dominant ideology in education that we talk a lot about in the College of Education where I teach, because it blames those who don't have access. So a struggling reader, I'm a literacy expert, a struggling reader is seen as they're not working hard enough or they don't care enough about school, therefore they're not succeeding. Whereas the root cause is not being analyzed. Is this student receiving high quality, adequate reading instruction by someone who's well-trained in reading instruction? So they ensure that they are learning how to read, how to think critically, how to write. So this idea of meritocracy is weaponized against the inequalities that exist in education because the blame is put on those who don't have access. So meritocracy as a metric, first we need to recognize, acknowledge, and learn that this is a dominant ideology that we all believe in. We think that this is the country where all the dreams come true. Therefore, if we work really hard, we will get there. But we have to first acknowledge that there isn't an even playing field. And some of us work at different ways to try and get to where we need to be. And it requires that much more access, or requires for us to even figure out how to get access before we can get to accomplishing what we want to accomplish. Laura and Taifha, anything that you want to add? All right, a couple more questions. Is there a place where one can find examples of racist policies enacted by Congress and state legislatures over time? For example, there is the FHA's redlining and bank redlining, to give one example, in the housing area.
I'll take a shot at that. I don't know that there's one place to go for that. I think there are lots of different books that kind of look at by historians that look at particular areas. If you look at, there are a couple of different critical race theory readers, and I'm just, I call it the Red Book. Taifha, I'm blanking on the title of that book. It's now about 20 years old, but it has a lot of the history. What is
it the big Red Book or the
Yeah,
little Red Book?
The big one. What's the title of the book? A critical race theory reader, maybe?
I think that's it. I don't have it
Yeah.
right next to me.
Yeah, it's called Critical Race. I'll put it into the chat. But I don't think there's an easy place to go for all of that. But accumulated in this body of work that we call critical race theory, it attempts to basically show how the legal system, and that was that first point that I made about white supremacy and the fact that these things are historically rooted. Okay, so
Laura, I think intentionally you might have muted yourself.
no, I was done.
Okay. Jose, any other questions in the chat?
No, I think we've captured the essence of all of them in the discussion that we just had. I'm just kind of scrolling through.
Yeah, folks, thank you, everyone. I know Jose and I have been receiving private messages, and then messages have been posted in the chat. And so we have a very long list that we're like combing through. If you have any more questions, we will wait a couple more minutes. And then I would like to also say that our speakers are, probably getting ready to get dinner and get everything else going on for the rest of their day. So it seems like we don't have any other questions. I will compile the list of resources that our speakers have shared with us, and I will send out an email to everyone who has joined us. Jose, would you like to close us out?
Well, thank you very much, Taifha, Laura, for taking time to
Thank you.
speak with us and share your knowledge. There's a lot of work ahead of us, as we all know, and really appreciate all of our participants who joined and listened, and we will continue to work together and develop additional programming in this area. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
coming.
everyone.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye.